Okay, let's unpack this. For years now, we've been tracking the shifting sands of the conflict in Ukraine, and it often feels like the narrative is constantly evolving. But what if the core objectives of one of the main players haven't really changed at all, despite all the headlines?
What's truly fascinating when you look at the source material is how consistent certain patterns remain, even as the immediate news cycle shifts. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the latest research and reports to truly understand Russia's persistent war aims, the current state of its military, and, well, how the world is navigating this really intricate geopolitical challenge.
You've supplied us with a stack of fascinating sources for this deep dive. Everything from the detailed assessments of the Institute for the Study of War to academic analyses on, Russian public opinion, even discussions from platforms like Reddit. Our mission here is to cut through the noise, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, and give you a real shortcut to being thoroughly well-informed on this critical topic. Let's start with what Vladimir Putin himself is telling us, because his statements, they offer a direct window into Russia's approach. Fox News reported just this July that Putin once again refused to end the war until Russia achieves its goals, despite direct calls from figures like President Donald Trump. This isn't exactly a new stance for him, is it?
Not at all, no.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these goals are remarkably consistent. Putin has repeatedly claimed Ukraine posed an existential threat because of its NATO aspirations. His clear, unwavering intent is to overthrow President Volodymyr Zelensky and, well, topple the government in Kyiv. And what's particularly intriguing, as several sources highlight, is how this aligns with a historical Russian obsession with their borders, seeing them as inherently indefensible and a deep-seated desire to control former Soviet territories.
And some sources even bring up specific concepts.
Yes, exactly. Some of our sources, including those discussions from Reddit, they point to the concept of Malorafia, or Little Russia. The idea there is that Ukraine is fundamentally viewed not as a legitimate sovereign nation, but rather a kind of breakaway branch of Russians, implying it's culturally and historically part of Russia's sphere.
So beyond the historical claims.
Well, beyond that, many analysts, like those in our academic sources, view the invasion as a clear land grab by an egotistical dictator, aimed at preserving a sphere of influence and, crucially, preventing Ukraine's potential success and growth from, highlighting Russia's own domestic failures.
And resources play a part too.
You'll also find discussions, particularly in the Reddit source material, pointing to natural resources, specifically valuable metals in eastern Ukraine and Black Sea gas, as a significant, though maybe often unspoken, underlying motivation.
Okay, so it's one thing to understand Putin's stated motivations, but our sources also dive into how these narratives are constructed. Many explicitly dismiss these justifications as mere propaganda. Some use very strong language, me calling them bull, designed primarily to rile up soldiers and dehumanize Ukrainians.
Right.
For instance, the whole denazification argument is widely highlighted as a false pretense, especially given that Ukraine has a Jewish president, despite, the acknowledged existence of some nationalistic militias within Ukraine.
And this raises an important question. What are the specific root causes Russia constantly refers to? The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, they consistently report that these demands haven't really changed since before the full-scale invasion.
And what are those demands, specifically?
They're comprehensive and, frankly, uncompromising, forcing Ukraine into permanent neutrality, severe limitations on its military size, banning any foreign military presence on its soil, and even demanding NATO withdraw from Eastern European states that joined after 1997. Essentially, it amounts to Ukraine's full capitulation.
Full capitulation.
Yeah. And Putin is also consistently portraying the current Ukrainian government as illegitimate, which seems like setting the stage to renege on any future agreements. And it's worth noting, Putin himself has stated regret for not invading earlier, which suggests this has been a long-term ambition.
Given all this, what do our sources suggest is Putin's underlying theory of victory in this protracted conflict? How does he see this ending?
Ultimately, Putin's theory of victory seems to rely heavily on a war of attrition. He firmly believes Russia can sustain gradual advances indefinitely and will ultimately win if the West eventually abandons Ukraine or its resolve simply falters over time.
And he still claims territory he doesn't hold.
Oh, absolutely. He continues to claim vast swaths of Ukrainian territory far beyond what Russia currently occupies, including strategically vital areas like Odessa and Mykolaiv, often referencing Novorossiya, that historical term for a region Putin views as inherently Russian, harking back to an imperial past.
But despite this unwavering stance, the reality on the ground, the costs, they must be mounting.
Immense. Despite Putin's maximalist goals, the reality presents significant escalating challenges for Russia. Western sources estimate Russia has suffered almost 1 million casualties. Think about that. And lost over 10,000 tanks and armored vehicles since the war began.
1 million casualties.
It's staggering. And to put that into perspective, ISW points out that Russian forces gained only a very limited amount of territory, just over 1,600 square kilometers between January and April 2025. And that came at an exorbitant human cost, roughly 100 casualties for every single square kilometer gained.
So the cost-benefit calculation looks grim. What about production? Can they sustain these losses?
Well, while Russia is ramping up production, experts suggest their current rates of tank and armored vehicle production are simply not sustainable long-term. Not without significant reliance on refurbishing Soviet-era stocks, many of which are, decades old and might not be up to modern standards.
That's a staggering human cost for such minimal gains on the battlefield. And yet, Russia continues to find manpower.
Mm-hmm.
What are the sources telling us about Russia's force generation efforts and some of the, more surprising measures they seem to be taking?
It's a mix of claimed volunteerism and some truly stark, even desperate measures. Putin claims 50,000 to 60,000 people are voluntarily joining the Russian military each month, though our sources indicate this figure is highly likely to be exaggerated. Probably significantly.
And beyond the volunteers.
Beyond that, the Russian military command has reportedly been sending wounded and medically unfit soldiers on assault operations, essentially using them as cannon fodder.
Really? Medically unfit soldiers?
That's what the reports indicate. And in a decree from December 2024, Putin stated that illegal migrants in Russia must either apply for legal status, leave the country, or sign a military service contract.
Wow. So tapping into absolutely every available pool.
It really highlights Russia's desperate need for manpower, especially when you consider its broader domestic labor shortages as well.
What's also fascinating, though, is how Russia's military is adapting to the realities of modern warfare on the ground.
Yeah.
They aren't just sticking to old doctrines, are they?
No, indeed. We're seeing continuous adaptation. For example, they're integrating motorcycles and even civilian vehicles into offensive operations.
Motorcycles.
Yes, essentially as disposable transports, trying to counter Ukraine's highly effective drone reconnaissance and targeting capabilities, get troops in fast, maybe bypass some surveillance. They are also heavily investing in their own drone production and forming specialized joint technical battalions to operate them more effectively.
But alongside these tactical adaptations, the issue of war crimes keeps coming up in the sources.
It does, and it's persistent and critical. The UN Human Rights Office, the OHCHR, reported a significant increase in civilian casualties recently. 968 Ukrainian civilian deaths and over 4,800 injuries just from December 2024 to May 2025. That's a 37% increase.
A sharp increase.
Yes. And they also found credible allegations of 106 Ukrainian POWs executed by Russian forces and widespread systematic torture. Furthermore, evidence continues to mount implicating Putin himself in the forced deportation and so-called re-education of Ukrainian children.
Which is defined as genocide under international law.
Exactly. An act explicitly defined as genocide by the Geneva Convention. And disturbingly, Russia is continuing to use chemical weapons, including CS gas, basically tear gas, in violation of international conventions, seemingly to flush out defenders from positions.
Okay, let's zoom out now to the global stage. Months ago, the Atlantic Council warned about a growing cooperation between what they termed an axis of adversaries, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, suggesting they are leveraging a, perhaps, distracted and divided United States to reshape the international order. How are these relationships actually playing out on the ground, according to our sources?
We're seeing concrete steps that definitely illustrate this cooperation. North Korea, for instance, deployed an additional 1,000 to 3,000 personnel to Russia's Kursk Oblast just between January and February 2025.
North Korean troops in Russia.
Yes, and their troops are reportedly gaining valuable combat experience. There's also quite a bit of speculation that Russia is providing drone and missile technology in exchange for these troops and, importantly, munitions.
And Iran.
Russia and Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement back in January, focused specifically on defense cooperation and intelligence sharing, deepening those ties.
What about China? That relationship seems key.
With China, there's clear strategic alignment and significant technological support. China provides roughly 60% of the foreign components found in Russian weapons, which is crucial for them. However, one Russian mill blogger Interestingly noted, China's approach is more like nothing personal, just business, implying it's more transactional, perhaps, than a deep ideological alliance.
So strategic partners, but maybe not a monolithic bloc.
Possibly. And what's also notable is Russia's push to, well, de facto annex Belarus. There are talks about deploying advanced Oreshnik ballistic missiles there by mid-2025. That's a significant step in military integration.
It's striking how Russia is building this axis. But our sources also indicate that its behavior is paradoxically pushing some of its own traditional partners away. What's the latest on that front?
Yeah, it's a crucial counter-narrative to the whole Axis idea. Armenia, for example, is very notably enhancing its relations with the West. They're actively reducing their long-standing security ties with Russia. That's a clear sign of shifting allegiances in the region.
And India. They've historically bought a lot of Russian arms.
Right. India, a major historical purchaser, is reportedly attempting to decouple its defense industry from Russia. They're increasingly moving towards Western suppliers. That's a big shift.
Okay, and on the Western front itself, we hear about aid packages, but also sometimes delays.
It's a mixed picture. We've seen a recent pause in U.S. weapons supplies to Ukraine, reportedly due to a Department of Defense review of stockpiles. Some aid promised under the Biden administration is apparently being withheld for now. However, European allies are continuing to step up their commitments significantly. Countries like Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Canada, Belgium, they're increasing military aid and boosting their own domestic defense production, recognizing the long-term threat Russia poses.
This all raises an important question about the ongoing diplomatic efforts, or maybe the lack thereof. What are the sources telling us about the prospects for negotiation or de-escalation?
Well, the diplomatic landscape is complex and, frankly, often contradictory. While you had figures like Trump and Zelensky discussing potential Patriot system sales and joint weapons production at a recent NATO summit, Russia has consistently rejected proposals for any longer-term ceasefire, even a simple 30-day one.
So not much appetite for talks from Moscow.
It seems not genuine talks. ISW notes that Russia appears to be strategically using any talks with the U.S. not really to find peace, but more to normalize its maximalist war demands and present itself as an equal global power negotiating terms. The Kremlin is even attempting to sow division by portraying European leaders as the ones seeking to prolong the war, contrasting them with supposed U.S. efforts to de-escalate. It's an information game, too.
And how does this play internally in Russia? What about public opinion?
Well, looking at Russian public perception, one study we reviewed notes how state propaganda and institutional trust contribute to what they call a paradox of optimism among a sizable minority of Russians. This is despite the clear economic impacts of the war. It shows the power of the state narrative.
And they're working to maintain that control.
Definitely. This is reinforced by actions like Roskomnadzor testing Russia's sovereign internet in ethnic minority regions. That's likely about controlling the information space, especially in times of instability, preventing alternative narratives from emerging. And finally, Western intelligence assessments consistently indicate that Russia is not only continuing the war in Ukraine, but actively preparing for a protracted confrontation with NATO.
Preparing for conflict with NATO.
Yes, building military infrastructure near the Finnish and Estonian borders, expecting to be capable of military operations against NATO sometime before 2030. They see this as a long game.
So we've really seen a fascinating, if quite sobering picture emerge from our sources today. On one hand, Russia remains deeply committed to its maximalist war aims in Ukraine, viewing the conflict through this historical and imperial lens, despite, immense cost and significant international condemnation. On the other hand, we see this complex web of international responses, shifting alliances, and ongoing determined efforts to support Ukraine while grappling with Russia's persistent and evolving aggression.
What's truly fascinating here, and maybe something to consider as we wrap up, is the sheer resilience and manipulation of narratives. Russia's state-driven glorification of war. I mean, changing its Victory Day slogan from never again to we can do it again, that's powerful symbolism. Combine that with heavy censorship and its efforts to control information through things like a sovereign internet. It deeply shapes public opinion within Russia. And this raises an important question, really, for you to consider. In an era where information can be so tightly controlled and narratives so skillfully manipulated by state actors, how do societies both within and outside authoritarian regimes, how do they truly discern reality from rhetoric? And what does that ongoing struggle really mean for the very possibility of a lasting and just peace?